Hello, I'm Dr. Jennifer Henry, a proud alum of the Faculty of Veterinary and Agricultural Sciences at the University of Melbourne, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today. For tens of thousands of years, Indigenous Australians have cared for and managed the land to source and produce food. These communities used sophisticated farming and agricultural techniques to produce an abundance of fresh food in a sustainable manner. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land I'm on today, as well as the traditional owners of the land from which you join us. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Humans are typically capable of experiencing 6 different tastes: bitter, salty, sweet, sour, umami and fat. The perfect food, wine and spirit pairing combines these basic tastes to enhance their positive attributes and provide a deeper and more pleasant overall taste. It might seem instinctive, but have you ever wondered about the alchemy created through the pairing of food and wine? How does pairing certain wines with certain foods contribute to our enjoyment of a meal? Whether you've ever wondered about the chemistry of taste or simply want to know which wine will perfectly complement your next Sunday lunch, this is the webinar for you. Today we are joined by 2 of the faculty's leading authorities in food and wine science, Barnes and Sonja Needs from the School of Food and Agriculture. They will be our guides as we explore the science behind food, wine and spirits pairing. Sonja Needs is a lecturer and tutor in wine, sensory science, climate change adaptation and animal science. She has experience in sensory science and human and canine olfactory systems. Sonja is particularly interested in how the human olfactory sense is influenced not only by mechanical physiology, but also by colours, sounds and textures, and how they influence the way we taste and smell, and our abilities to recall different sensory pictures. Barnes is a lecturer in wine technology and viticulture with over 30 years' experience. He's a graduate of Roseworthy Agricultural College and holds a Master's in Wine Technology and Viticulture from the University of Melbourne, where he has taught for over 10 years. Chris is a consultant to the wine industry and consults privately to companies such as Wine Selectors, Stewart Wine Company and McPhee's Wines. He's also a sought-after wine judge and wine quality consultant. Chris, let's start with the basics. It might be an obvious question, but what is wine?
Well, grapes. That's fundamentally it. I mean, I think it's really important for people to understand at the basic level that what's in a glass of wine when you look at it and pick it up and start to taste it is grape and grape byproduct. There is nothing else. So all of the textures and flavours, whether they be as exotic as a raspberry or a strawberry, all come from the grape variety. Yes, there are textures and flavours that also come from byproducts of the grape in the sense of we have ethanol, and that's part of the fermentation of the sugars in the grape. But it's just fermented grape juice. So it is grape and what's technically known as grape byproduct, the ethanol being one of those things.
So why are there so many differences in the flavours of various wines, and why do not all Chardonnays taste the same, for example?
Sure. Well, to answer the first part of that is about the word Chardonnay. Chardonnay is a grape variety, and grape varieties are less perplexing to understand than different varieties of apples. And as we see in a supermarket, we have Granny Smith, we have Delicious, we have Jazz apples, and perhaps there's a new apple coming to the supermarket. Now, all of those are varieties. There are many thousands of varieties of grape, and each of those varieties has different flavour profiles, different texture profiles, which can then be reflected in the finished wine. To answer the second part of that, Chardonnay, why is there a difference? There's a difference in the first instance because of the quality of that grape variety in terms of the raw material, that fruit, as we always call it fruit in the wine industry, that fruit that's coming from the vineyard to the winery. So there's that in terms of quality parameters, which is really about concentration of flavour, and then there's the winemaking inputs. And those things can give you differences in terms of flavour and texture, as well as, very importantly, as the consumer knows, a huge difference in price when it's on the shelf in a retail store.
We'll come back to the issue of price later, but we hear a lot about additives in wine. What is added to wine and why?
Well, the additives that are used in wine are essentially to do with preservation. They're preservatives. Now, the two key preservatives in wine, one, and this is not essential, but this is the vast majority, and I'm talking about by volume, well over 90% of all wine. The vast majority of that is the preservative sulfur dioxide. Now, a lot of people are concerned about sulfur dioxide in terms of preservative generally in food, because, I mean, wine is a food. It's considered that by the federal government. Now, the use of sulfur has occurred since the days of the Romans, so that's the first thing. It's not new. There are concerns about levels, but the level of sulfur in wine, measured normally in parts per million, is very small against a lot of processed and packaged food. So that's the first one. And the second one, really essentially and pretty much only in white wines, is citric acid. Now that's vitamin C, and that's used again in a great number of preservatives in terms of foods, which you're talking about colour retention, you're talking about brightness of colour. And it's to give white wines their freshness. Now, that again is natural, as is sulfur dioxide, because both of those, well, citric acid's there in the grape to begin with, and sulfur dioxide is, in elemental form, a byproduct of fermentation itself. So again, all part and parcel of grape and grape byproduct.
Tell us about fining agents and what options there might be for vegans.
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of fining agents, now this is an important thing, is fining agents are about clarification in wine. So that particularly in a white wine, it's most notable. When you hold up the vast majority of white wines, it's clear, it's bright, it's translucent. Now that's because there have been agents added to that, perhaps, but not always, to help that settling of the cloudy or sediment that might be in there. Now those fining agents should be left behind before bottling. Now the fining agents can be a large number of things. Now certainly they can be animal byproducts, say for example egg white, say for example isinglass, which is derived from fish, but there are now vegan fining agents such as pea proteins. So there again choices with winemaking, but all of those things, I mean pea protein for example is not grape and grape byproduct. So by definition it should be left behind in simple terms before the wine reaches bottle and reaches the consumer.
Let's talk briefly about sulphur. Is it really responsible for hangovers?
Yes, in a very, 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 and I use the word very again, small percentage of the population. The percentage of the population that have a genuine sulphur allergy would find themselves unable to eat many processed and packaged foods anyway. They'd be well aware of that in the first instance. What's really responsible for hangovers is an excess of ethanol. That's simple as that. It's having a glass too many, and that will give you the hangover. So fundamentally it's that. I mean, some people, look, everyone's different in terms of their physiological reaction to various chemical compounds. But the key thing is going to be too much ethanol in too short a time. We could talk about that at length, but it's simply that in the vast majority of cases. I'm not underestimating food allergies by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not, discounting people's personal and philosophical preferences in terms of food. But the vast majority of people, it'll be just simply too much ethanol.
Are you seeing an emerging market for non-alcoholic wines?
Look, yes, there is. I mean, the market at the moment is getting a great deal of, airplay. It's talked about a great deal. But if we're talking about, the idea of zero, low alcohol, that's a discussion about de-alcoholising wines and also about techniques for producing wines of slightly lower alcohols. The discussion of reducing the amount of ethanol, alcohol that's in the glass in front of you can range from as simple as why not put some soda water and a few blocks of ice in that glass of Riesling, and therefore you have a less alcoholic drink. And that's been going on for time immemorial. To the other hand, you've got, as I said, de-alcoholised wines, which go through essentially a process of reverse osmosis to try and remove the ethanol. And this is an emerging technology in the sense of trying to retain the key components in the wine that actually the flavour compounds are able to bind to. And one of the reasons why wine works in the first instance is because you've got the ethanol for the flavour compounds to bind to and therefore give you this flavourful drink with structure, mouthfeel, mouthfeel, and the beautiful richness that balances with those fruit flavours.
Sonja, let's start looking at taste. Why are some wines described as tasting like blackberry or citrus?
So with wines, when they're described as being tasting like blackberry or citrus, it's not because we've added blackberry or lemons to the wine, but like Chris said, some varieties actually have those flavours in the berry themselves. So if you go into the vineyard, Shiraz is a prime example. So Shiraz, if you go into a cool climate vineyard and you pick the berries off the grapes and you taste them, often you can taste pepper, they taste peppery. And what you're tasting is not a taste as such, but it is a volatile molecule that you are smelling through your nose called rotundone, which can be in cool climate grapes in large amounts. And that rotundone is also in black peppercorns. So it's why Shiraz grapes might taste like black pepper, because they have similar compounds or the same compounds that are in those foods.
Chris, looking more broadly at the language of wine, we hear people talking about body and texture and acidity. Tell us about how we have come to describe wines.
Oh, well, I mean, I guess the language of wine, first of all, which is what we discuss when we're teaching undergraduates and postgrads about wine. A language is what it is in terms of an accepted series of terms, of, jargon, if you like. And wine has its own jargon. And the reason why we do have a jargon is for communication, so that I can talk to somebody on the other side of the world about a wine that I'm making or that person's making, and we can come to common terms. So that's, the first instance. And that's also why it seems to some people arcane, because all jargon, if you're outside that world, is arcane. I mean, think about the jargon of IT, for example, whatever it might be. But getting to your specifics, things such as body and texture, that's about the tactile sensation in your mouth. If you're talking about acid, you're talking about that as simply the acidic feeling, or what people would call sour in their mouth. Now, there's a very good example of jargon. We don't, in wine terminology, have an accepted term of sour. Why? Because that's a negative term. Why don't we use a negative term? Because most of us are trying to sell the wine, and we don't use negative terms to consumers, because the average person is not going to say, gee whiz, give me a glass of that sour stuff, will you? So it's jargon, but there's good reasons behind it. You can explain in all of those cases.
Sonja, you clearly have a passion for matching food and wine. Why is it that people seek to pair food with wine, and to what extent can this really enhance our enjoyment of a meal?
So you can really make or break a meal by having a good pairing or a bad pairing. So a really great meal paired with a really great wine that matches with that meal can enhance the meal and make it taste better. But you can have a really great meal that's badly paired with a wine, and the wine can actually make the meal not taste so great. And the way that you make a pairing is by considering the textures, so the textures of the food and the texture of the wine, the weight of the food and the wine. So if with your wine, Chris was talking about body earlier, wines come in light-bodied, so they're lighter in your mouth, they're lighter in flavour, they're lighter in intensity, and you can get light meals as well. So if you're thinking about a salad or poached fish or poached chicken, as opposed to something like chips and steak, which is a heavy meal. And wines are the same. You can get light-bodied, medium-bodied, full-bodied. So a full-bodied wine is something like a big red Shiraz, Barossa Shiraz, or a Coonawarra Cabernet Sauvignon. They're full-bodied reds, and they're textureful, they're mouth-filling, and they're quite heavy on the palate. And so you would want to match the weight of the meal with the weight of the wine. So full-bodied wines with full heavy meals, light-bodied wines with lighter meals. The other thing you wanted to look at is harmonious matches as far as flavours. So you can get a complementary flavouring match. So if you think about when we have fish, we would put lemon on that fish. And we often get wines that have lemon flavours in them. So things like Riesling is actually quite citrusy in character. So to match a citrusy Riesling, so it hasn't had lemon put in the Riesling, but it has those flavours there. If you've got a lovely white fish that you're eating and you drink that with a nice citrusy Riesling, it's a lot like putting the lemon on the fish, and it creates this beautiful complementary match. Equally so, if you were having something like a mushroomy dish, which is quite earthy, you might drink an earthy wine with that. So something like a Pinot Noir, which has some earthy characteristics, that matches and those wines. So that becomes a congruent match, or a match where you've got similar flavours matching the meal and the wine. And they're a really easy way to think about when you are eating and pairing, is either thinking about what goes with this food, what flavours go with the food I'm eating, and think about the flavours that are in the wine, so what that wine tastes like, other than it just tastes like wine. Or you might think about what flavours are in this food, and can I get a wine that has similar flavours, so things like the earthiness in the mushroom with the earthiness with the Pinot. And that's a really good way to start thinking about matching with foods, but also thinking about those weights and textures and all of those things. And if you get that right, and there's some really simple rules to get that right, but if you get that right, it can really enhance a meal and make a pretty average meal absolutely great.
So could the right bottle of great red save a bad cut of meat?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the thing with red wines is they have tannin. So tannin is what you get if you're not really sure what tannin is. If you've ever drunk black tea, and when black tea as it gets stronger, you notice it gets a little more bitter, and it gets this slightly drying texture in your mouth. And what that is tannin. Now, all red wine has tannin in it, and tannin comes from the skins and the seeds of the grapes. So tannins naturally in skins and seeds of grapes, and actually tannins in the skins and seeds of most fruit. Now with tannin, it creates this drying sensation, and it actually creates weight in the wine as well. But the other thing that tannin does that makes it absolutely beautiful to go with meat is it actually acts as a bit like a meat tenderizer. So if you've got a cheap cut of steak or a cheap cut of meat and you think it might be a little tough, you could think about marinating it in the red wine. But an even better thing to do, a really great thing to do, is you get that cheap cut of steak and you put it in your mouth, and while it's in your mouth you can take a mouthful of your tannic red wine and macerate the meat with the wine in your mouth, and straight away you'll notice this amazing sensation where that tough stringy piece of meat all of a sudden becomes tenderised and will taste so much more luxurious and much more like an expensive cut of meat. So it's a really good way to make a cheap cut of meat seem like a very expensive meal.
Fantastic. So talk us through the science of what happens when we're eating and tasting. It's through our taste buds, but also a combination of smell and other sensory experiences.
So we use all our senses when we eat. And most people are quite surprised by that, but we use all our senses. So the first thing we do before we even put the food in our mouth, or even the wine for that matter, we look at it and we do assess what we're eating by how it looks. So if it looks lovely, our perception straight away is going towards this is going to be a nice meal. The next thing that we do before it reaches our mouth is we smell it, and we smell it using our nose, and we smell it orthonasally through the front of our nose. And we will smell that food and we make some assessments about it. So we take in the aroma of the food, and we're not just taking in one smell, but what we're smelling is all the volatile molecules produced by that food. And some foods will have hundreds of volatile molecules that are all combined to make them smell as they do. So we smell before we've even put it into our mouth. So then we take the food and we put it in our mouth. So the moment it goes into our mouth, our taste buds take off and they start to taste the wine or the food. Now with taste, there's 6 basic tastes: bitter, salty, sweet, sour, umami, which is savoury, and fat. There's actually probably 10 to 20 tastes, but science hasn't quite got there yet. We're not really sure. We haven't proven what other tastes there are. There's probably metallic, piquancy, pungency, mouthfulness. So there's a whole range that different scientific organisations are working on, but we haven't quite proven it yet. So we put the food in our mouth and our taste buds will tell us if it's salty or sweet or sour or savoury. With wine, all wine is acidic. It has malic acid and tactaric acid that's naturally contained in the berries, in the grape berries. So all wine is of a pH below 7, so it will taste a little bit acidic to us. And again, we don't use the word sour, we use acidic. So some wines are very crisp, which means they've got a little bit more acid. Most wines in Australia are not sweet. They don't have a lot of sugar, and some of them actually have no sugar in them. If they seem sweet to us, often as that is a perception because what we're tasting is fruit, and we associate fruit with sugar. But our tongues often, we don't actually perceive any sweetness in a lot of our wines, particularly if it's called a dry wine, because dry means that it is not sweet. Most wines have got a little bit of bitterness, particularly red wines, because the tannin, remember I discussed tannin earlier, tannin's a little bit bitter, so you may perceive a little bit of bitterness. Wines don't have fat. The other thing we're doing while we're tasting it is we're smelling again, but within our mouth, and we're smelling retronasally, which means we're smelling our wine from inside our mouth. And we have a cavity at the back of our mouth that allows those volatile molecules to go up into our olfactory system. And again, that's where we're perceiving all the other flavours. So when we think about bitter, salty, sweet, sour, umami, our tastes, that doesn't cover things like chocolate and coffee and lemon and citrus and berries and all of those other things that we consider flavour are actually more to do with aroma than the actual tastes themselves. But they combine with those tastes. The last thing that happens when we put things in our mouth is our mouth is full of nerves, and those nerves pick up on how the textures of the food is, or the wine in this case, or both. So is it crunchy? Is it liquidy? Is it viscous? Is it watery? Is it smooth? All of those things, as well as the thermal temperatures, the thermal differences. So if a wine particularly is warm, it will seem much more fruity and sweeter than when we drink wine cool. So the colder our wine is, the more acidic it will seem and the less sweet it will seem. So thermal differences makes a difference. And to food as well, because when food is warm, it is more volatile and therefore more aromas are available to us, so they seems more flavourful. So there's a lot going on when we eat. We're smelling, we're tasting, and we are feeling, as well as judging what we are eating by what we see. And even sounds can make a difference.
You've done some work on memories and mood and health. How does that fit into our experience of wine?
So largely memories fit in with our olfactory system. So when we smell anything, those smells, when they react through our olfactory system, signals go to two parts of our brain. One part is the experience part, so that's telling us that what we're smelling. So if we smell, say, a lemon, we smell it and they say, our brain will tell us that smells like lemon. But the other part of the brain that goes to is into the amygdala, which is our memory centres, and it will activate any memories that are associated with that. So if you grew up and you had a lemon tree in your backyard, and every time you walked outside, and lemons bring amazing memories about your grandma making lemonade or something like that, when you smell lemon, those memory centres are activated. So smells very strongly activate memory.
Chris, when pairing wine with food, what are some of the basic rules we should follow?
Oh, look, I think keep it as simple as possible and think first of all about food in terms of its weight, and Sonja's talked about that. And I think it's really important in food and wine matching, and I think this is just a general discussion of wine, is if you think about wine, as I mentioned earlier, it is a food, it becomes relatively straightforward. So think about it in terms of structure and think about it in terms of flavour. So a lighter bodied wine, something that tastes fresher, and has less viscosity, we'll go with lighter foods. So, you know, that's the classic, as Sonja was talking about earlier. The fresh grilled white fish goes with a fresh light white wine. A flavour that enhances the fish and enhances the wine would be citrus, so you choose a citrusy variety. And in Australia, what abounds is Riesling. If you're talking about, again, in terms of fish, but a seafood dish that's richer and heavier, let's say you've got plenty of money because it's coming to a festive season and you want to lash out on some crayfish or you want to lash out on prawns, richer shellfish, then you'd have something with heavier and more full-bodied in terms of the wine. So that would be a Chardonnay. Now, not only because of the grape variety, but also enhanced by the fact that a lot of Chardonnays, and traditional Chardonnays, have been matured in oak. And that oak, the tannins from that oak and the flavour from the oak, also gives greater richness and texture in that wine. So you're talking about having richer and more fuller textured wines with richer and more fuller textured foods. So that's in the, I guess, the white wines. And in the red wines, it's a similar sort of thing. If you think about at the far end of the spectrum in terms of what's the heaviest and most powerful foods that you'll eat, and most of them in our context in Australia traditionally are going to be things that are grilled and roasted red meats. And grilled and roasted, just simply doing that, and that's the case also if you're talking about vegetables, you know, whether it be mushrooms or eggplant, but that grilling and roasting gives a whole new dimension of texture. So you want something with powerful textures. Now, in, again, the Australian context, which is, you know, our great grape variety Shiraz and Cabernet Sauvignon, perhaps even a blend of the two or some other varieties blended with those, is going to have that richness. Also, the flavours there are going to be fairly powerful, and the flavours in most red meats, and I'm talking about those vegetable dishes, you know, mushrooms and eggplant are again quite powerful flavours. Going back and, you know, just in red wine, back to something that's lighter. If you're having something that's very common for us to eat today, which is very, I guess, for want of a better term, sort of al fresco food. So you might have a little bit of the wood-fired pizza, you might have a little bit of smoked meat, some cheese, it's all on a platter. You want something with lighter textures and fresher flavours. And that goes perfectly with varieties that are relatively new to Australia. I mean, Pinot Noir is an example of that, or even newer again in terms of Australia, would be the Italian red varietals such as Sangiovese. Now, they're the sort of lighter in the sense of their textures, and they tend to present themselves with flavours that are more about fresh fruits, often red and dark fruits, rather than the Shiraz and Cabernet, which can be cooked red and dark fruits. So if you just think about what's in the dish, I mean, this idea of, and it's not a coincidence, it says food and wine matching. Most people, not myself, will order the food first and then the wine. I tend to order the wine and then say, well, what I'm going to eat with that. But most people look at the food first, think about flavour, texture, think about flavour and weight or texture with the wine and put those together. But the only thing I should always say this is there is no wrong. There's only degrees of rightness. So, you know, if you're enjoying, you know, a white wine with that pizza or that platter, or if you want to drink a white wine with even a, you know, a heavy grilled meat dish, and you're enjoying it, well, you're enjoying it. And so it works.
Terrific. And what about sauces? Say a heavy, creamy versus a mushroom sauce or something lighter. What role do they play?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that you said it in the sense of it's a heavy cream sauce. I mean, it's interesting. We don't eat a lot of those these days for sort of, I guess, reasons of diet and so forth, or modification of diet. But you need something that's going to cut through that, literally that fat that's there in the dairy. So you'd be looking at a richer, more fuller-bodied white wine like a Chardonnay or a red wine like one of the classics of the Shiraz blends or Grenache Shiraz blends, Cabernet, that sort of thing. And with your mushroom, again, go more about the flavours and think about that with more powerful flavours. But any sauce, by definition, is adding weight to the dish. So that's, you know, part of this, again, idea of balance.
So before we get more into the specifics of pairing, let's talk about price. Why do we see an order of magnitude difference in the price of wines?
Well, the order, look, it starts in the first instance very simply because what we are, and this is, I think some people forget it, this is agribusiness. This is agriculture, and we start in the vineyard with a crop that is grown and comes ripe once a year and then has a market value. And the market value of those crops, of those grapes, varies enormously. It varies because of a demand and supply, a simple equation. Again, it's the same with all agriculture. If there's demand for it, then the price of the commodity rises. At the moment, for example, there is great demand for Pinot Noir because it is popular, but also there is great demand from Pinot Noir, particularly from Tasmania. Why? It is seen that the flavour profiles are, in inverted commas, better, but they are certainly in more demand. So you can get vast differences in terms of, if you're a grower, the price that you're selling those grapes per tonne onto a producer. And these can range 5 and 8 and 10-fold in terms of a difference in price. So you've got the price of the raw material to begin with. You've then got the price of what you do with that in terms of what we do in the winery. And things such as the use of oak barrels can add an enormous amount of cost to it. If you are making it on a smaller scale, which is usually seen to be more attention to detail, I use that term seen to be, perceived to be, that will add cost because you're talking about lots more people, lots more individuals working in that organisation. And we know, people cost money in terms of that, and they have to be skilled. And then, of course, you've got what happens when it leaves the winery to a certain extent and goes out into the marketplace, and that becomes simple marketing. So there are 3 aspects to it. One is very straightforward in terms of the price of the commodity. The other is relatively straightforward in terms of the production cost. And then there's this marvellous thing about the market. And I would always say to people about that is, why is one handbag $400 and the other's $4,000? But hang on, I've got one here for $40 and they all hold the same things. Now, I'm being terribly simplistic, but it is actually complex, but there are some really simple market forces and fashion at play here too.
Chris, you're an experienced wine judge. How much do judging criteria have to do with what the consumer actually likes to drink?
Judging in the Australian sense and in the traditional wine judging comes out of the agricultural show system. I mean, we are, as I keep saying, an agricultural pursuit. And that's about improving the breed standard. And again, I know it doesn't sound terribly glamorous if you're talking about great wines, but it's about the same concepts as they were originally, which was in improving the breed standard of cattle or sheep or whatever, whether it be for meat or wool or what have you. And so you have a group of experts in that particular field saying, with a reference point of what the breed should be going towards, where the end point should be. And so judging, has been relatively arcane in that sense. And it hasn't necessarily related a great deal to the consumer. I mean, one thing about judging which is positive, is it's all done blind. We have no idea what the wines are. We do judge them in classes, just like we wouldn't judge, sheep with cattle in the same class. So we judge Chardonnays together, we judge Shiraz together, to use those sort of very obvious examples. But I don't know, when I'm looking at 2 masked examples of Shiraz out of a lineup of 50 or 60, whether one is meant to be retailing for 14 or the next one's 40 or the next one's 140. So in terms of what the consumer might expect, or in terms of value for money, that's not been part of the traditional show system. There are shows that exist which have, over the years, and these are both international and some of them in Australia, that try to be more focused on, I guess, relevance to a consumer making that choice in a retail outlet. There are some shows that have tried to do matching with food and wine because that's what 80% of people do. They drink wine with food. There are problems with the practicalities of that when you've got 60, 80, 200, 500 wines. And that's a small show. But, it's really relatively technical based on what winemakers and wine professionals think is the breed standard at the time. So to give you a very simple example of this, using oak. Do we think that a lot of new American or new French oak is a good thing in Shiraz? If we, directed by the chair of the show, say no, we are going to award higher points to those wines showing less oak and lower points to those wines showing more oak. And I've been around for long enough to know that there was a time when wines that had a huge amount of French and particularly American oak would win gold medals. Now, they're lucky to get a bronze. That's fashion and change.
Can I ask both of you about the role of the vessel? How much does that really affect what it is we perceive, whether it's a terrible plastic cup at a first-year ag student barbecue compared to the finest glass that a judge might use?
The actual glass does make quite a bit of a difference. So some of it is to do with perception, again, to do with the way our brain perceives. If we're drinking out of a plastic cup, straight away you're not thinking that this is going to be a quality thing that you're drinking. However, it is not just perception. So there is a lot to do with the shape, and glasses are shaped a particular way, and they're shaped that way because, again, they're shaped almost tulip shaped now. If you notice, most of our glasses have a smaller top closing with a large amount of air inside the glass. And that air inside the glass, we only put a small amount of wine in a big bulbous glass, and that is because the rest of the glass will hold all those beautiful volatile aromas that we can smell. So as you put the glass up to your face, all the volatile aromas that make the wine smell so beautiful, we're taking those in orthonasally through our front of our nose, and we get much more flavour from drinking out of those glasses. So they're designed to allow all of the volatile aromas to be held and captured just above the wine so that you get a great big noseful of aroma before you take in the wine. The shape of the glass also determines where the wine goes in your mouth as you tip the glass back. Some shaped wines will actually throw the wine further back into your throat, and others further forward. And there's actually a lot of science behind the shaping of glasses for certain wine varieties. Rydell do a lot of work, and that's why you can buy a glass that's specifically for a Pinot or specifically for a Shiraz or specifically for a Riesling. The glass shape's actually designed for those wines.
So while not suggesting that ag students take a great glass to the barbecue, they could maybe at least spend a bit of time swishing the wine around in their plastic cup and having a good smell before they drink.
I think when you asked that question, you were talking about the vessel. I actually started to think about the bottle rather than the glass. But one thing that's really interesting is that more expensive wine is in heavier bottles with a great big punt. And people say, well, why is that? It's just this understanding from marketers that if you as a consumer go into a retail outlet and you spend $60 or $70 on a bottle of wine and you pick it up and it's heavier, it's somehow more serious. Now, I know this sounds ludicrous, but then we're starting to go down the path of marketing. That's an interesting science in itself. But it is, you look at that. Next time, consumers in the supermarket or the retail store pick up a cheap bottle of Pinot Noir as opposed to a very expensive bottle of Pinot Noir, and I can assure you that bottle of the $60, $70 Pinot is really heavy.
Let's look briefly at spirits. What foods go well with what spirits?
Look, it's interesting. I mean, spirits themselves, in terms of their evolution, really didn't evolve. I mean, spirits are around about 1,000 years old, but they didn't evolve to be drunk with food. But it is true that there is a food and spirit matching, but you need to be talking about spirits that are relatively complex and I think have complexity of both structure and flavour. There's a great fashion for gin at the moment. I mean, I love gins and we've done quite a bit of work with gins, but they tend to be spirits that are revolving around aromaticity rather than structure and the aromatics. But if you talk about whiskies and, the scotches, particularly in terms of those that have been aged in cask for, in some cases, decades, you can get quite complex textures as well as complex flavours. And the more complex that, the better chance it is to go with foods. But you are talking about a relatively limited range of foods that tend to be revolving around textures of salty and savoury, a little bit of sweet. Certainly some sugar can be cut by those spirits, but also the complexity of flavours. So, I mean, I've done quite a bit of work in the past with Scotch, particularly high levels of Scotch in terms of single malts at the cask strength. and they will work with certain foods. But it's harder to do and match than it certainly is with wine. I mean, I think it's I guess, a specialised area, but worth experimenting with.
What would you eat with Scotch?
Well, I think if you're talking about the Scotch that is classically the single malts from the Isla, the West Coast, that are always going to be smoky and particularly peaty, then not surprisingly smoky, but also smoked seafood, because Isla is all about the peat that comes from what was originally kelp and seaweed. So, and they have iodine in them. So it's not surprising that salty and smoked seafood goes well with those. You know, if you're talking about something with higher notes of Scotch that might come from the Highlands, the idea of heather and those sorts of things, what can be beautiful with that actually is some game meat. You know, of course that comes to mind, things such as pheasant and those sorts of things. But the other thing that works beautifully with a lot of Scotch is actually just simple dark chocolate. So, you know, at the end of a meal, if you have a small glass of really good single malt and a little square of really good dark chocolate, those two things can be marvellous together.
What about gin and vodka?
Vodka's very, very light. So when we think about vodka, it's not got a huge amount of flavour. And gin's actually almost vodka that's been redistilled on the second distilling and had juniper berry and a whole range of other botanicals added to add more flavour. So gin's more flavourful than vodka, but neither of them are meant to be drank neat. So they're both meant to be drunk with cocktails. And really, I suppose, what foods would match with those is dependent on how you mix them. They're not meant to be drunk as a single shot, so they're meant to be mixed. If we're thinking about gins with gin and tonic, again, it would depend on the garnish that you use in your gin and tonic. So, but generally nothing too heavy, because you're not looking at strong flavours with this. So there's plenty of ethanol, but not so much flavour. So both vodka and gins, even if you're drinking them as cocktails, unless you're drinking them as a strong cocktail, so you might be drinking, say, a vodka martini, or you might be having an espresso. If you're having an espresso martini, perhaps that would go really well with a dessert. But generally, if you are mixing them and you're making them light, like a gin and tonic, having them with a lighter, something to nibble on would be better than having them with a full meal.
So to help us as we head into the festive season, what classic pairings can you recommend? Let's start with, say, a starter like prawns or oysters.
So oysters, classic match with oysters is sparkling wine. So I would recommend a sparkling wine from Tasmania. Prawns are a little bit more creamy. So if you've got a creamier sort of a meat or a creamier dish, you would add that with something that is a wine that is a little bit more acidic. So you could, again, have it with a sparkling wine, but you could have prawns with something like a Riesling.
Okay, what about a classic pairing with the mains, say turkey, pork, ham?
So turkey, pork and ham, an absolute classic Australian match would be sparkling Shiraz. And sparkling Shiraz is very Australian. It was an Australian invention. And it is fruity, but it is also red and it is sparkling, so it's very celebratory. And it's the fruitiness in the sparkling Shiraz goes really well with things like turkey. If you would add cranberry sauce to turkey, or you would add a fruit sauce to pork as well, those fruity sparkling Shiraz would be an absolutely amazing match with all turkey, pork and ham.
What would you pair with a vegetarian main?
So vegetarian main, again, like Chris was saying, if it's a roasted vegetarian main, for me, any sort of roasted vegetarian or roasted veggie dish, particularly if it's root vegetables, goes beautifully with Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir have some earthy characteristics. It's often lightly oaked, so you get some smokiness that goes really beautifully with a whole range of vegetarian main dishes. If the vegetarian main had a little bit of cheesiness in it as well, Pinot Noir often has a little bit of acid that helps cut into that sort of creamy, cheesy sauce as well.
Okay, so in Australia, we've finished our mains, we've run out and jumped in the pool, run around in the backyard, played totem tennis for a bit. We come back in for plum pudding. What do you pair with that?
So for me personally, plum pudding, I would pair with Pedro Jimenez, which is a sherry. And it's a very, very sweet sherry, and it actually in itself tastes like plum pudding. And you only have a very small amount. You just sip it. It's much the same as a port. And it literally tastes like plum pudding, and it is just a match made in heaven because it tastes like the plum pudding that you're eating. And in fact, if you had that plum pudding with vanilla ice cream, you could pour a little bit of the Pedro Jimenez over the top as a sauce, as well as sipping on it as you taste that plum pudding, and that would be an absolutely special, amazing thing to have.
Sounds like a death row dessert.
Yes.
What about pavlova or chocolate-based desserts?
Pavlova is a really interesting one because it's extremely sweet. So it's very sugary and sweet, and you've got to be careful when you're matching very sweet things. A lot of people think of having dessert wines, which are very sweet wines, with desserts, but you've got to make sure that when you're matching sweet with sweet, that the wine is actually sweeter than the dessert. Otherwise, if the food that you're eating is sweeter than the wine will actually taste a little bit bitter. So be careful when you do that. If I was having a pavlova, and particularly if it had some nice fruit on top, I might actually think about having something like a Moscato, like a sweeter Moscato. But you can get some really lovely dessert wines. So something like a late harvest Riesling, which has got acid and fruit characteristics and is quite sweet, would go quite nicely with that pavlova. If I was having chocolate's a little bitter. So if you're having like a dark chocolate mud cake, something like that, the chocolate, even though it's sweet, it's actually got some bitterness in it. So having a slightly sweeter wine again, so you might have an aged Riesling, but red wine actually goes quite well with that as well. So something like a chocolate cake, I might think about a fruitier red wine. So something like, for me, a Nebbiolo, which is an Italian variety, and you can get Nebbiolos quite readily in Australia, and it's got this beautiful sort of cherry and rosy sort of characteristic which goes nice with the chocolate.
If there's a cheese course in there, what would you pair with various cheeses?
This is where our dessert wines really come to the fore. So a late harvest or a botrytis dessert wine would go very well with cheese dishes. Aged white wine goes beautifully with cheese dishes. So if you can get your hands on a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old Riesling or Semillon, those aged white wines go absolutely beautiful. They get this beautiful preserved, syrupy, honey characteristic that goes very, very nicely with cheese. The other thing that goes well with cheese dishes is actually just red wines. So a Cabernet or a Shiraz, if you've got stronger tasting or stronger smelling cheese, so if you've got the harder cheeses, something that's got a bit more oomph about it, you could have something like a Cabernet or a Shiraz.
Chris and Sonja, thank you very much for sharing your insights. And that's it for today's webinar. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation on food and wine pairing for the festive season. Thank you and goodbye from the Faculty of Veterinary and Agricultural Sciences.